Hey everyone, I've got another AWS project for you. With this one, we're going to build our very own email marketing campaign, a system that you could send emails from. Something like this, a weekly newsletter with fun challenges, or any type of email you want to send on a regular schedule. Now, obviously, there are lots of actual email marketing systems out there that you would probably use, but it's totally possible to build this in AWS, and it's a great way to get some hands-on experience with multiple services. And that's really the point of the video. And speaking of multiple services, here's what we're going to be using. The simple email service, or SES, to actually send the emails. Lambda for some email sending logic and personalizing the emails. S3 will be used to store the email templates and a list of contacts to send to. We'll use EventBridge to set up a schedule and trigger the Lambda function. And then, as always, we'll need some identity and access management, or IAM. We need to do some work in here to make sure that our services have access to do things in the various other services. Now, before we get started, a quick word about cost. Everything that we do is eligible for the free tier, except for EventBridge's scheduler functionality. So if you're inside the free tier, most of what we're going to be doing is free, but even outside of that, the charges will be minimal, maybe 1 or 2 cents. EventBridge's scheduler costs $1 per million schedule invocations per month. We're only going to invoke it once or twice, so practically 0 cents there. So from a cost perspective, this will either be free or 1 or 2 cents, but even so, I will walk you through how to delete everything at the end of the video, so stick around for that. And before we dive in, let's just talk about what you need if you want to follow along. I'm actually going to be using a tool called eraser.io. This is going to make it really easy to diagram things as we're building. And we can also keep track of checklists as we go. Link in the description if you're interested. But let me just start a new file for the project. I'm calling this project Tiny Tails Mail. And then let's make a checklist of what you're going to need. I'll just paste in a few lines here. And we'll make it a checklist so we can keep track of what we're doing. All right, if you want to actually be able to send and receive emails, there's a couple things you need. You're going to need addresses, or at least one address to send to, and you need to be able to validate that. So AWS will send you an email, and there's a link in there that you're going to have to click on. So it has to be a valid email that you have access to. This can be a personal email, like Gmail or something like that. So make sure you've got that. You'll need an email address to send from, also one that you can validate. This needs to be from your own domain, like mywebsite.com. This can't be a personal one, so make sure you've got that. Or if you don't have all that set up, obviously you can just watch me do that part. You'll need some basic knowledge of AWS. I'm assuming you do if you're watching a project video, but if you're a total newbie, you should still be able to follow along. And then finally, you'll need a text editor or somewhere to write HTML code. I will also upload the HTML code that I'm using, so you're welcome to just use mine if that's easier. All right, so that's what you need. Now let's talk about what we're building overall, some high-level requirements. So the first thing we need is a place to store email templates and a list of contacts that we want to send emails to. For this, we're going to be using the Simple Storage Service, or S3. And I'm going to diagram what we're doing as we go along. Let me just give myself a little bit more space over here. We do have some nice templates to start from. So let me start with diagram as code and then cloud architecture. This is going to give us way more than what we need, but if you want to play with this on your own, it's a nice starting point with some of the different components over here. I'm actually going to get rid of everything except S3 for now. So I'll just clean up the code over here on the right. You'll see that the diagram updates on the left. So this is diagramming as code, which is pretty cool. And that should leave us with just an S3 bucket, which is what we want. And I will toggle over to the both view so we get our checklist and the diagram. There we go. And then we'll build on this as we go along. But let's go out to the AWS console and create this S3 bucket. Navigate to S3. And create a new bucket. For a name, I'm going to go with TTT Email Marketing for Tiny Technical Tutorials. Now, I do already have a bucket named this that I was using as prep, so I'm going to put a 2 at the end of mine. You'll need to use a different name. These do have to be globally unique, but pick a name and make a note of it because we will need to update it in a few places later. But you can leave all the defaults for everything else. We do want to block public access, a best practice. Leave all the defaults, and then create the bucket. And success. Let's go to view the details. That will take us to the bucket. Now inside of here, we want to store an email template, an HTML template that we'll actually send to people. And then we need a list of the contacts as well, the email addresses to send to. So for the email template, this is one that I created with the help of ChatGPT. This is just simple HTML. You can see the code here. I will upload this and link it in the description if you just want to use this one. Or obviously you can code up your own from scratch or code your own with some ChatGPT help as well. The one thing to point out in here is that we do have a placeholder for first name. So we want all of these emails to say hello and then first name of the contact that you're sending it to. And then the rest is just HTML code with the challenge for this week's newsletter. All right, and then the other thing that we're going to place in the S3 bucket is a CSV file of our contacts. This is a super simple file, just first name, comma, email. And I've filled in 2 emails that I'm blurring out so they're not available to the world, but make sure the emails that you put in here are ones that you can actually validate, meaning you can receive emails and click on a link that AWS sends you if you want them to actually go through. I'll upload this file as well and just put in some placeholders for you, or you can pretty easily create one from scratch as well. But make sure to call it contacts.csv. And then back to our S3 bucket. If you're not already here, make sure you navigate to the Objects tab and want to drag over that contacts.csv and then emailtemplate.html. Make sure that the files are called that because later on we're hard coding some things in the Lambda function. Not always the best idea, but for this demo, you will need these names to get it to work. So we'll just drag those over to upload them to the bucket. And then upload. And success. Close out of that message. And good. So we've got the S3 bucket, we've got the list of contacts to send to, and we've also got an email template that we can send. So let's go check this off of our list. First requirement done. All right, now we need a way to send emails. For this, we're going to be using the Simple Email Service, or SES. There is some setup work required here, but let me first just add it to our diagram over here so we can keep track of things. I'll open up our editor. And to add a new node to the diagram, we just need to type in the service. So SES, we'll do an open bracket, grab that icon, AWS SES. There we go. We will connect things a little bit later under the connections, but for now, let's just work on the SES part and getting that going. So back over to the console, I'll open up a new tab here, and let's go to SES. Now I did some setup work previously, and it's got me set up with a sandbox. If this is the very first time you're using this, you're probably going to get a slightly different experience. I did grab some screenshots of my initial setup, so let me just walk you through those. So if it's the first time you're using the Simple Email Service, you'll get a button here to get started, so click on that. And then you need to enter the email address that emails will come from. You, again, do have to validate this. So AWS will send you an email. There's a link in that email that you need to click on, so make sure it's a valid email address. Then you can say next. That will take you to the next page to add your sending domain. This can't be something like a gmail.com. This has to be your own domain. I'm using tinytechnicaltutorials.com. If you need to purchase a domain, you can use Amazon's Route 53 or other providers like GoDaddy and so on. A little bit outside of the scope of what we're doing here. If you don't want to go through all of that, obviously you can just watch the video, but you won't be able to send and receive emails. Okay, at this point, Amazon's going to send an email to that email address. You'll need to open it up, click on that link to verify that you actually own that email address. And once you do, you'll be able to send emails from that address. So hopefully that gets you through the setup. Let me take you back to the live dashboard that I have set up now. If you successfully did all of those steps, then you also will have a sandbox like I've got here. And this is just a sandbox. It is not production. It's totally fine for what we're doing, but there are limits. You'll see those displayed here. In the real world, if you want to get out of the sandbox and into production, you do need to take this one additional step down here to verify your domain. So we entered a domain earlier, You don't actually have to verify it unless you want to move into production. If you do, then you will say create identity. This will give you 3 CNAME records that you need to copy over to your domain provider, like GoDaddy, for example. You need to let those changes propagate, which can take up to 72 hours. And then up on the top, you'll need to request production access and describe your use case for sending emails. So a little bit of work involved there for production. The sandbox is totally fine for what we're doing. That's all I've set up here. So we should be good to go. But there is one other thing that you can do down here just to make sure that stuff is working, and that is to send a test email. So I'll click on that. We can do a formatted email or a raw email, which lets us put in HTML. I'll select raw, and then scrolling down, let's say we want to test the scenario where everything is successful, but you can also test different scenarios here, like what happens if it bounces, or what happens if there's a complaint, and so on. But I'll just paste in the HTML that we have from the email template, grabbing this from Visual Studio Code. We'll paste that in and send the email. And success, we get a nice green check mark. So everything is working there. So we know that the from email address is good, but because we don't have a verified domain, we need to validate the individual email addresses that we want to send to. This was back in our contacts.csv file, so I was using 2 different emails. You might have more, you might have just one, but we're going to need to validate both of these if you want to be able to send to them. It's actually pretty easy to do. So let me come back here. These are called identities. And if we view all identities, I've got the one, this is my from address that I entered outside of this video. But let's create a new identity for an email address. I'll enter the email address, defaults for everything else, and create an identity. So it just sent us an email. Let me go grab that out of my inbox. It should look something like this. You just need to click the link. And success. So we can now start sending emails to that address. Then back to the page that we were on, if we go back to identities, we've now got the 2 verified. Let's create one more. I'll go through the same steps here really quickly. This is to verify the other 2 address from my CSV file. Okay, so now I've got a valid from address and then 2 valid 2 addresses that I can use. Perfect. Let's go back and check this off of our list here. Moving right along. All right, next step, we need a way to basically merge the email template with the contacts and then send them to SES, to the email service. And by merge, I mean we fill in that first name that was a placeholder in the email template, so we get personalized emails. For this, we're going to be using Lambda, so all of this is serverless. We're not going to go spin up new servers, new EC2 instances, or anything like that. It's all going to be done just with a little bit of code in a Lambda function. So over here, let's add that to our diagram. Lambda and AWS Lambda. Now for this one, we do want to start defining some connections. So Lambda should go out and grab things from S3, grab the email template and the contacts, and then bring them back, kind of munge them together inside of the code. So we need a connection going both directions here. In Eraser, the way to define a connection, you get some nice help here. We're going to do a bidirectional arrow for this one. And it recognizes the other components on the diagram, so this will go to S3. And then once it's munged everything together, it needs to send those personalized emails off to the simple email service to SES to actually send them. So we need a connection going from Lambda to SES. This one's just an arrow connection, just one direction to SES. Perfect. All right, now let's go build that Lambda function. Back to the console. I will open up a new tab and go to Lambda this time. I've got that in recently visited, but you can also just go there directly and then create a new function. We want to author from scratch. The function name, I'm going to call mine send SES email to contacts. I'm going to add a 2 to the end of mine since I already have one from my prep. We're going to be using Python as the runtime here, Python 3.12. You can leave defaults for these things here. The execution role, so this is what gives Lambda permissions to do things in other services. We're going to create a new role with just basic Lambda permissions. We will need to come back and update this later, but for now, that's all we need to do. And then scrolling down, let's create the function. Okay, we've got a function now. Let me close out of that and scroll down to the code section. Now, so you don't have to watch me write this from scratch, I've got some code already that I will make available. I've just got this in a Google Doc out here. There's a few different pieces in here. So we've got the Lambda function and then some other things below. So just make sure you're grabbing this first page right here. But this is the code. And very important that you update these areas in red with your own information. But let me grab that and we'll come back to the Lambda function and just replace everything here with this code. And then I'll just briefly walk you through what's happening here. We've got some setup. So we're going to be working with S3 and SES. So getting the Boto 3 clients for both of those. Boto 3 is the Python SDK for AWS, if you're not familiar. And then scrolling down, we're specifying the name of the S3 bucket. So make sure you replace this name with yours. I actually need to put a 2 at the end of mine this time. We're going to grab the CSV file called contacts. If you chose to name yours something else, make sure you update that name. We're also grabbing the email template, email_template.html. Again, if you used another name, make sure you update that here. And then we basically parse the contacts file. So get a list of all of the different contacts, all the email addresses in there. And then we're going to loop through them. So for each one of those, we want to replace that placeholder. We had a placeholder in the HTML template for first name. We want to replace that with the first name out of the CSV file. And then we actually call SES and say, hey, go send this email, this personalized email to this address. Now here's another one that you're going to need to update. So make sure that the verified from address that you set up in SES is right here. I'll update it with mine, but very important to update it with yours or this is not going to work. So that's the code basically taking contacts, merging it together with the email template, and sending it off to SES. Now another really important step, scrolling up, is to actually deploy this. If you don't deploy it, nothing is going to happen. Okay, perfect. And then we also want to test the function just as a good sanity check before we actually go trigger it from an external source. So let's set up a new test event. If you click on the arrow here to the right of test, configure test event, create a new event. I'm going to call this test send email. And then scrolling down, we can actually just use a really simple generic test event. Our code isn't going to rely on the incoming event data, meaning we're not passing in the name of the contacts file or the name of the HTML template. All of that is hard-coded in the Lambda function itself. In the real world, you probably would want to pass that stuff in from an external source, but since all of that is in our code already, we don't need to pass it in the test event here. So I've got some simple generic JSON out here that we can use in the same place where you got the Lambda code. Just grab this right here, the test event, and then we'll replace everything here. Generic test event, the function's not actually using this, but we are saying that this is a test, and then save. And then let's run the test. So just click on the blue button. And access denied. Dun, dun, dun. A big fail. But I did want to show you this. It's a pretty common thing to come across. And this is where the permissions and the execution role come into play. So let's come back to our diagram. And our Lambda function is going to need access or permissions to a couple things. We've got a connection over to S3, and we've also got a connection to SES. The first thing it's trying to do is go out to S3, and it's getting access denied there. Even if that was working, it would eventually get access denied to SES as well, because we haven't set that up. When we created the Lambda function, we did say go create an execution role. So let's go see what it gave us there. back in the function, scroll up a little bit, come into configuration. I'll get rid of this message here, and then down to permissions. Here is the role name. If you click on that, it'll open up in a new tab. And let's see what this gives us permissions to do. So scrolling down to permissions policies, if we expand this one for the execution role, we just have some default permissions in here to basically write to CloudWatch logs. There's nothing specific to S3 or SES. So we need to add that manually. To do that, I'm going to go create a new policy with those permissions in it, and then we'll attach it to this role when we're done. So over here, policies, I'll actually open this up in a new tab, and then we'll create a new policy. Now you can go through here and use the visual editor and pick your services and add permissions and so on. I've actually got some JSON code for this as well that you can just copy and paste. So toggle over to the JSON editor, and then back to our Google Doc here. Grab this code right here for the IAM policy. And then we'll replace everything here in the policy editor with that code. Now, very important, you need to update the name of your bucket right here, your ARN. It should just be updating the bucket name. Mine is actually marketing 2, so I need to update this as well. Make sure you leave the slash and the asterisk at the end, but just update your bucket name. That should be all we need to do. But this basically says we're allowing GetObject, so getting things out of the S3 bucket. And then we've also said that we want to allow sending emails and sending raw emails, which is the HTML code, through SES. Okay, so with those changes, just scroll down, say next. I'll call the policy Lambda S3 SES policy, and then scrolling down, create policy. Okay, so now the policy exists. We just need to go back to the execution role and attach it. So back to this other tab that I had open here. This is the execution role for the Lambda function. Again, by default, we just have some CloudWatch log permissions, but we can add permissions up here on the top right, attach policies. You could also just do an inline policy and just paste that code directly into the role here. It's just a little cleaner to keep it as a separate policy, so you could attach it somewhere else if you wanted to. So attach policies, and then we want to go grab that one that we just created. I'm actually going to refresh since this page was open when we created the policy. So let's just make sure we've got everything here. And then this one was called Lambda. And then scrolling down, let's go with a filter type customer managed. So things that I created. And to page 2. There we go. Lambda S3 SES policy, that's the one we just created. And then add permissions. So that's attaching it to the execution role. So now the Lambda function should have the permissions it needs to talk to S3 as well as SES. So let's go back to our Lambda function. Back to the code tab. I'll close out of these tabs that we had open earlier. And let's run that test again. So you should be able to just click the blue button again. And this is looking better. I'm not getting an access denied. Yay! So email sent to the 2 different email addresses. Excellent. Let me go check the inbox. And there we go. Yay! So it's filled in my first name. That was the one placeholder that we had. Everything else is the same from the template. But it worked perfectly. Okay, moving right along. That was actually the hardest part. Let's cross this one off the list. And then we need a way to trigger sending those emails. In other words, we need to trigger the Lambda function. And there's lots of ways that you can do that with Lambda. You could trigger it when you upload a new email template to the S3 bucket. You could trigger it from the console, from the CLI, or something else. We're actually going to use EventBridge, which used to be called CloudWatch Events. But with this, you can set up a schedule to trigger it, say weekly or daily, or whenever you want to send your emails. So over here on the diagram, let's add a node for EventBridge. And then this one's going to need a connection as well. EventBridge to Lambda is the thing we're going to trigger. Perfect. Now you can also move things around in here. So if you find that you want a different spot or farther away or anything like that, you can do that. But you need to define things over here in code. But that's looking good. So let's go to EventBridge in the console. Let me just open up one of these tabs I've got already, and we'll go to EventBridge. And then over here on the right, we want to create a new schedule. So select Schedule and then Create Schedule. I'll call this Send Weekly Email. And I'm going to add a 2 on mine. And then scrolling down, you choose your schedule pattern. So you can do this just one time, or you can set up a recurring schedule like every week or every month. Based on the name of mine, I intend to do this weekly. But just for testing purposes, let's do a one-time schedule. I'll select today's date. And then the time. So according to my clock, it's 15:24 right now. So let's go with 15:28. Give me 4 minutes to get all of this done. I think I can make it. Select the time zone. It's defaulted to the local one, which is great. And then the flexible time window, this basically gives it some leeway, basically a window in which it can run. I'm going to turn that off and say I want it to run at exactly this time, and then say next. The target, there's lots of options here, but basically we want to invoke our Lambda function. So I'll select that. That'll scroll us down to actually select the Lambda function. So mine was the send SES email to contacts 2. We aren't going to send in any payload here, so just scrolling down, next. The schedule should be enabled by default, so we'll leave that there. If you want to take any action after the schedule completes, like deleting, that will delete your schedule. I'm going to say none. There's other things here around retrying, encryption, permissions, and so on. For permissions, we are going to create a new role for the schedule. You can just leave everything the default there. Say next. Review. And then create schedule. Okay, so it's completing the schedule setup, step 1 of 12. I'll pause briefly and come back when it's done. Okay, it is 15:26 right now, so in 2 minutes, they should trigger the Lambda function. The Lambda function should send us an email. So I'll pause for about 2 minutes. We'll come back and take a look at what happened. Okay, my mail has arrived. It is 3:28 or 15:28, right on schedule. But let's just go take a quick look at what happened and how you can debug if you didn't get the email like you thought you should. So back here in EventBridge, if you come into the Target tab, the target, of course, was our Lambda function. There's a handy link to it here. So if we click on that, that'll open up a new tab. And then in Lambda, if you come into the Monitor tab, this is where you can see what's going on with this particular function. Now, the first thing I'm noticing here is the time zone is UTC instead of local. So I'm going to switch that over to local. Let's take a look at our invocations over here. So if I just hover over that one, I'm getting a 5:17 local. So I think we're zoomed out too far. Let's come up here and adjust our time range. It's looking at the last 3 hours. Let's go with the last 5 minutes. See if we can get a different level here. There we go. There's our 15:28. There's the one invocation. We've got success up here, and everything's looking good. You can get additional information here as well. But if you're not seeing what you thought you should, you can always come into the CloudWatch logs. And in here, you can get more information about what might have gone wrong if you didn't get your email. And just generally a good place to know about for a lot of different services in AWS. So scrolling down to our log streams, if we look at the latest one here for 15:28, I've got success messages. I sent 2 different emails. If you expand those, you get information about the response. Everything was good. But if you got an error or something just didn't work, that should show up here as well. So that's a good first place to do some troubleshooting. All right, but let's cross this one off the list. Done. Now, before we do a cleanup, I want to give you some ideas for how you could enhance this and make it a little bit more real world. And I'll just jot this down here in Eraser. So here are some ideas. Instead of just using a CSV file like we have for the names and email addresses, you could incorporate DynamoDB, the NoSQL database, to hold those names instead. That's much more real world. You can also build a UI that you could use to trigger sending the emails. So you click a button, let's say, to send the weekly email. In that case, you'll probably want to use API Gateway. And then API Gateway can trigger your Lambda function and everything else that we've already built. If you want to do these, I've got another video that has a similar setup with API Gateway, Lambda, and DynamoDB. If you want some ideas there, I'll link this one below. But this would be a great way to continue your learning, challenge you a little bit, and see what you come up with. All right, but back to this list here. Let's go do some cleanup. Like I said in the beginning, this is probably going to be free or just a few cents if you leave it running. But if you have no intention of using it again, then let's clean it up and get rid of everything. So starting with EventBridge, let's come in here and we will delete our schedule. So if you've backed out of that, just come into all of your schedules, and then down here at the bottom, select your schedule, and then delete. Confirm. Next, we want to go to the S3 bucket. And here you want to back up to all the buckets. Select the one that you were using for this project, and then say delete. Now you can't delete a bucket that has stuff in it, which ours does. So first we'll need to say empty bucket. And then confirm by typing permanently delete and empty. That deleted our objects. Now we can delete the bucket by clicking on this link right here, delete bucket configuration. And then we'll enter the name of the bucket. Delete. All right, we're getting there. Now let's go to the Lambda function. Scrolling up to the top here. Come back to all of your functions. And I'll select the one that I was using. And then up here, actions, and delete. And we'll say delete. And confirm. Close. Let's come into the simple email service and delete the identities. These were the email addresses that you validated. I'm just going to delete the 2 that I sent to, because I might want to keep the from for something else, but you can delete everything if you want. Just say delete. And then lastly, let's go over to IAM. And then policies. It won't cost you anything to have these policies in here, so it's fine to leave it from a cost perspective. But if you just want to keep things tidy, let's search for customer managed, and we want to look at that one for the Lambda SES S3 policy that we created. Just scroll down here and go to the next page. There we go. Select that one and delete. All right, with that, just one final thing to do if you haven't already. That's to hit the like button if you found this helpful, and also consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you got it working.